I'm gonna start producing a new content piece called D&D Rule Solution, and in that we're gonna discuss everything that's not necessarily just the rules of D&D, but a little bit of theory around like where things came from, specifically as it relates to D&D 5e. So keep an eye out for that. We'll continue to record those throughout this stream, and I hope it's something that you'll enjoy. It's going to talk a little bit about the game that we love, and maybe some of the uncleared corners that people gloss over when they get into D&D. That's interesting and sometimes just good to know. Today's rules resolution, we're talking about the who's who of Dungeons and Dragons. So these are some names that you might know and some you don't. Today we're talking about Jeremy Crawford. You may have heard his name jump up from time to time. Jeremy Crawford is the lead rules designer on Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition. And if you've read a Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition official book, he's probably had something to do with it. He's also the DM of Acquisitions Incorporated and the de facto rules as intended guru behind the Sage Advice Compendium. And the Sage Advice clarifies and lays out rulings for some of D&D 5e's most hotly debated rules and applications. Today's D&D rule solution, if they're more like guidelines, why are there even rules? Well, D&D is a game and games have rules. We need to be playing the same game on both sides of the screen as our players are and our game masters are. So it's important to have some understanding of the rules. But the rules are more tools for logic than hard, fast approaches, in my opinion. The number one rule is to have fun, of course. So for that reason, the rules are also malleable. And one of the rules that I do pull into play is the rule of cool. This was not invented by anyone who you think may have invented it. It's just a good general rule to make sure that everybody around the table is having a good time, and that includes the game master. More D&D rules solution. We're talking about the backstory of Dungeons and Dragons and the D&D's 5e Player's Handbook. The most important info you've probably never read includes a little snippet that talks about the origins of the rules and the mechanics of Dungeons and Dragons. The fact that it actually had its origins in the Midwestern United States, specifically Wisconsin and Minnesota. It was based around collaboration of friends sharing stories and the three core pillars of role play, exploration, and combat. While the origin story of D&D has vague in descriptions and distinctions, they always seem to involve the names of Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson, usually followed closely by Holmes, Mulvey, Cook, Greenwood, Hickman, Weiss, and more. Early versions of D&D rulebooks and sources were actually named after their primary contributor. And that's something that I learned from my community on chat, actually. In today's rules solution, we're talking about character creation stripped down and what really goes into a D&D character. How do you begin to breathe life into that character that you want to play? Well, I usually break down character creation into these simple steps. Talk about the concept, type, melee, the action or support behind the battle and the battle scene. Then I ask my players to select a background so they can determine the story behind their player. From there, I ask them to only then consider what class they might like to play based on the first two questions. And then I'll usually encourage them to choose a race that backs up that class or complements that class. Although this isn't really hard and fast either. If somebody wants to play a gnome fighter, then they should be a gnome fighter. Then I ask them to close their eyes and picture that character in combat in a role play or exploration scenario and how they would play out. And then I help them build the rest of the character out according to that vision. From there, I ask my players to think about writing out a description of how somebody would describe their character after seeing them for the first time to help them nail down a visual representation of what that character is. And then just get ready to have the best gaming experience of your life.